Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. Today I'm going to talk about some structural issues that are common, especially at the editing phase. So maybe you have a project that you've been working on for a long time. Maybe you've made a lot of edits and maybe you know a lot about story structure. You've watched my story structure series or you've watched other series on story structure or you've read books. You feel like you really get it. You're not really confused and you consider yourself to be at a fairly high level, at least intermediate level with writing, but for some reason your project's just not coming together, the book is just awkward, the pacing feels wrong, you can tell something is off structurally, but you feel like you've pretty much got everything in place. So that's what we're going to talk about today, some really specific structural problems that are common at the more intermediate and up to advanced level writing. So if this is your first video on this channel or if you're new to story structure, I don't recommend starting with this video. I'm not really going to be explaining a whole lot of the basic terminology or the basics of story structure. I'll explain a little bit, enough that you can kind of get the gist, but I don't think this is a good starting point if you're new to story structure. So I do have a series on story structure. I will put a link to that in the description, and I recommend starting there if you're new to structure. So, if you've been working on your project and it's not coming together, what are some likely structural culprits? So let's start at the beginning and sort of move forward, but I am going to skip a lot of structural points. So let's start with the debate. So we have the status quo, then we have the disruption, disrupts the status quo, and then we have the debate. The debate is, of course, a time where the character is questioning whether they will get involved in the main conflict. They might be trying to determine how they will get involved or if they will get involved. You probably have something like this in your novel already, especially if you're writing, at the intermediate level or above. You probably already have something that qualifies as the debate, at least superficially. What tends to go wrong with the debate and why it's a very common structural problem, even for writers who know a whole lot about structure, is often we think of the debate as a hesitation. So we think of the debate as the disruption happens, a door opens, an opportunity opens in the life of the character, and they're debating about whether or not they're going to go through that door. And that's completely true. That's accurate to the debate section. But there's this whole other element of the debate that's often overlooked, which is the destruction of the status quo. So this door opens, and it's not just a pleasant, simple, nice opportunity that the character can look at and decide if they want to get involved in or not. When this door opens, it runs sort of cracks through the status quo. It disrupts everything in the life of this character, or everything important in the life of this character. So we have a character who was comfortable in their status quo. It might not have been great. In many cases, the status quo isn't great. It's not ideal, but they were okay. They were comfortable. The disruption breaks the status quo. It ruins it. It destroys it. So we have a character who was comfortable with their life. The disruption happens. They're very uncomfortable now in the status quo. That piece is often omitted in favor of hesitation to get involved in the conflict, pure hesitation. But this isn't really an intellectual thing for the character. It's a very emotional thing for the character. It's not just this thought of, should I get involved or should I not get involved? It's not this, if I step through this door and take this opportunity, maybe it'll go wrong. Maybe things will be uncomfortable. It's a way more emotional reaction on top of that. So there's, of course, the intellectual side of it, but there's this emotional side of it as well, which is the character having to sit in and experience their status quo in a state where it's extremely broken. It feels very uncomfortable. It's not what it used to be at all. For example, in Toy Story, Woody is the favorite and the admired toy during the status quo. And Buzz's arrival at the disruption causes Buzz to become the new favorite and admired toy. We see it demonstrated that Buzz's arrival ruined the status quo during the debate section. We see it in the shift in Woody's interactions with the other toys, who are now impressed with Buzz instead of Woody, and in the way that the boy Andy replaces all of his Woody decor with Buzz decor. It's very clearly demonstrated that Woody's status quo has been completely destroyed. We also see that super important emotional component. Woody, like most characters in the debate section, isn't clinging to the ruined status quo out of rationality or out of logic, but out of emotion. That's because the character is hoping they can continue to cling to the scraps of the status quo that might still fulfill at least some of their emotional needs. This is why the characters in the debate section tend to react by trying to force the status quo to behave normally, or they might react with denial. For example, Woody insisting he isn't being replaced by Buzz, even when he obviously is. Something that I think can throw writers off is this perception that the status quo isn't ended yet. So the disruption doesn't end the status quo, that the status quo runs through until the decision is made, until the character chooses that they're going to step through the door and engage in the main conflict. But the status quo is ruined at the point of the disruption. The disruption either very overtly or potentially in many cases very subtly breaks the status quo. And what we need to demonstrate in the debate section is both the debate about, do I get involved? Do I not get involved? Do I go through this door and engage in this conflict and take on all these new risks and challenges? Or do I stay in the status quo even though it's broken? We need to convey that, and we need to actually see that the status quo is broken. We need to actually demonstrate in tangible ways how things are different now, how things can't be the same. And this can be psychological. It could be the character's eyes were opened to a fact or to a reality that they weren't aware of previously. So the disruption lets them know something is different from what they expected. Maybe they saw a ghost, for example, and so now they're debating, are ghosts real or are ghosts not real? They can't just go back and pretend like they never knew anything about ghosts at all, because they do. They saw a ghost, so now they know something is up. They might think maybe I'm going crazy, but they know something is different. They can't just go along pretending like it didn't happen. So with your debate section, if it feels off, and you may notice that something feels off, if it's hard to define the second quarter, it's hard to define when the second quarter starts, that's a good sign that the debate maybe didn't exactly meet the requirements, or it just feels a little squishy. So you just feel a little bit like there isn't this like emotional gut punch involved in that decision. You don't feel like this was a hard decision. If the debate is a very easy choice, you know something is going wrong, because it should be a very difficult choice. But that's also why in my structural system I include the decision, which is the very, very end point of the debate. It's a thing that happens that lets the character know once and for all, for 100% certainty, this status quo is definitely ruined. I'm not going to fix it. It's not going to go back to normal. It's something that they witness or something the character experiences that helps them to make that choice, that this status quo is just wrecked. It's just not going back to what it used to be. And that's something that helps them to engage in the main conflict, to step through that door and take on that opportunity and then enter into the second quarter. So that's the first thing that often goes wrong in intermediate advanced level fiction. The next thing that often goes wrong is the midpoint. So the midpoint is extremely important because the middle of the novel spans so much space. So the middle of the novel is at least 50% of the story. It's at least the middle two quarters. So when we're talking about that, the second and third quarter, one sign that something is wrong with the middle, something's wrong with the midpoint more specifically, but the middle in general, is that you could swap scenes between these two quarters. These two quarters should be very different from each other. They should be distinctly different. The third quarter is not just more of the second quarter. So if you can swap scenes between the two and they still make sense, you know that something is wrong with the midpoint. Another sign that something's wrong with the midpoint is just it feels, you have that feeling of the saggy middle. It just feels slow. It feels meandering. It feels sort of like it goes on and on and on in the middle, and it's just not that exciting. It doesn't have that pacing that you really want to go for. So with the midpoint, a mistake that writers often make is thinking of the midpoint as a twist. So we often talk about the midpoint twist. And that is, again, it's right. Just like when I talked about the debate, it's not that superficial understanding is wrong. It's that there's more to it than that. So it's not just a twist, it's a pivot. So we want to see the protagonist pivot at the midpoint towards different activities, different goals. And I think one of the reasons that we struggle so much with those middle two quarters is that the second and third quarter, there isn't as big of a difference as between the first and second. So between the first quarter and the second quarter, often in the second quarter, we're seeing a new location, in many cases, new characters, new allies, new enemies, new roles, new all kinds of things. Tons of things tend to change between the first and second quarter in most fiction. It's not always true. Something will definitely be changed. It's not always everything, but in many cases, it's everything. It's a new school, it's a new job, it's a new relationship. It's a huge, huge shift. In the second and third quarters, once we reach the middle, we don't see as big of a shift. We don't see, in many cases, we're not going to see new characters or new locations. We might, but not necessarily. In most cases, it's going to look basically the same. The character's going to be with the same people in the same places, but they're not going to be doing the same things. That's the most important thing that I want you to take away from that. Whether anything changes with characters or locations, which it may or may not, what the character does is going to change. For example, in Disney's The Kid, Russell, the protagonist, is visited by a child version of himself. In the second quarter, he criticizes the child, tries to get rid of him, but at the midpoint, he comes to believe that he needs to help this kid learn how to fight in order for him to go away on his own. So in the third quarter, there is a big shift in their interactions towards Russell teaching his child self how to fight and how to be a little bit less of a nerd. This results in totally different types of interactions between the two of them, very different actions with a different type of intended outcome. The overall goal of getting rid of the kid is the same, but the types of actions the character is undertaking are completely different. A major problem with the middle is sort of perceiving it as putting the character on a track and then just watching them run through that track. When you hit the midpoint, it should be such a pivot. It should be like picking the character up, turning them around and putting them on a track going a different direction. We should see a big shift. And again, it's hard to see how big that shift is because a lot of the trappings are going to be the same in many cases, the characters, locations, etc. But we want to see a change in intention, a change in goal, a change in action. So what happens at the midpoint, it needs to change what the character logically does next. For example, say you had a case where you had a haunted house. Maybe at the midpoint, the character realizes that this ghost is a specific person. So first quarter, they don't know what's up. They saw a ghost. They're debating, is there a ghost real? Are ghosts real? Is there really a ghost or not? The second quarter, they've made the decision. In the first quarter, they made the decision. So in the second quarter, they're like, okay, there's a ghost. We got to deal with this. At the midpoint, they realize the identity of the ghost. So now instead of just, what do I do about a ghost? Now we have a shift in intention, goal, actions. It's, okay, we have to research this specific ghost. We've got the name of the ghost. We know who the ghost is. We have to now research this ghost specifically. So we should see a shift in what is happening between those two quarters. If you don't have that, you're going to really, really have that saggy, mushy middle feeling where it just feels like the novel goes on and on and on and not a whole lot happens, even though maybe tons happen. Maybe you have lots of really interesting scenes. You might still give the impression that nothing is happening because that's a long space to not refresh the story, and we want the midpoint to be a refreshing moment that sort of shifts things, gets things going in a new direction, makes things interesting again for the reader or for the viewer. So lastly, I want to talk about, again, the transitions between the quarters because that's what we're really talking about more or less. So when we get to the end of the third quarter, start of the fourth quarter, so the fourth quarter is going to be your climactic sequence. A big problem with many writers, many novels, is that it feels that the character is going sort of at a straight line. They pass right over where that transition should be between the third and fourth quarter until they run into the antagonist. So it sort of just feels like a straight line. There might be a rising action, so it might feel like a rising line. They're getting closer and closer and closer, and they get to the antagonist. But what we actually want the shape to be, what we actually want to feel in the third quarter, is the characters going up towards the antagonist. They're getting closer and closer and closer. according to their own perception, often not according to reality, but in their own perception, they're getting closer and closer, and they hit a wall. And this wall is what we would call the dark night, the lowest point, various things. It's called a lot of different things, but it's a low point because the character hits this wall at the end of the third quarter, and it feels impossible. It feels insurmountable. Sometimes this is a dead end. It could be they were completely wrong in what they were doing. They realize they're wrong. They've hit a dead end. They're stuck. It could be that. It could be some sort of major defeat, major loss. Something really, really bad happened. Normally, both externally and internally, there's normally a loss of both the general external goal and the general internal goal. So we typically see both. But in any case, we want them to hit that wall. If they don't hit that wall and they just go straight to the antagonist, the climax is going to feel very abrupt. We have nothing to sort of frame it. And the dark night, the lowest point, and then that realization, that second plot point realization of what they need to do to succeed, that frames the climactic sequence. That's what gets us ready and prepped as readers or viewers. It gets us prepped for that climactic sequence. So if they don't hit that wall, which is very common, it's very common to have the second plot point, but not have that point of hitting the wall where they're stuck and they don't know what to do. It's very easy to miss that, to skip over that and think that you just need a realization, a pure realization, no emotional aspect, no running into a wall aspect, just the realization. And then you have nothing framing the climactic sequence. So then even though everything else might be in place, it just feels so abrupt. It feels like all of a sudden it's just a climax and then all of a sudden it's over, and it's very dissatisfying for your readers. For example, at the lowest point in Shrek, Shrek loses his new romance with Fiona and he rejects his new friend Donkey, and he goes home alone to his swamp, seemingly having lost everything that he had gained over the course of the story. Without this dip downwards, without him hitting this wall where he has no perceived ability to succeed, if he had just gone straight to confronting Farquaad without that dip down, the ending would have felt very abrupt. So those are the three main problems that I tend to see with structure at that more intermediate level, at that more advanced level. And I think now you can probably perceive why this would be such a big issue. Say you have a novel that's more or less working, you more or less have all the plot points, but some or all of those transitional moments are missing. And by transitional moments, some of these are quite long, quite lengthy. For example, the disruption and the debate section all the way through, that's the bulk of the first quarter. But it's all related to making that transition, to making that shift between the quarters. If you have a story where more or less everything is in place, but you don't really demonstrate the disruption of the status quo in the sense that the disruption happens, but you don't really demonstrate in the debate how broken the status quo is, the reader isn't really going to feel prepped for that second quarter. They're not going to feel like they really understand entirely why the character has committed to it, why they've committed to getting involved in the main conflict. Why are they engaging in this conflict? You may have failed to establish sufficient motivation for that involvement. As you continue through, you don't have that midpoint turnaround, that pivot in action. Well, then the middle's a little saggy. It's a little boring. It's a little slow. Even though maybe you don't really need to change a whole lot, you just need to change something about the approach or something about the reasoning. We might be just getting into what the character's logic is the big thing shifting between the second and third quarters. And then maybe you get down to or all the way up or down, whatever way you want to perceive it, to the lowest point, and it's not there, and they chug straight through to the confrontation with the antagonist. Then you have this really mushy, really loose, poorly paced story where it's basically ready. You basically have all the plot points, but because you're missing those big, important transitional elements, what defines the different quarters, it just feels kind of sloppy, kind of slow, kind of boring. So I really hope that this explanation was helpful. I'm going to talk I think video after next, I'm going to talk about how to edit in a little bit more of a literal sense. But in this video, I really just wanted to go over those common structural problems that can happen at the intermediate level to advanced level, because I feel that this is something that really holds back a lot of writers, especially when you feel like everything is there, that all the structural points are technically there, but it's just not working. So I really hope that you found this helpful, that maybe it solved some problems for you that you're having with your book. I will be back with a new video soon. I believe the next video, it will be a much more produced video with graphics and things like that. And it's going to be the flat arc structure combo video, how the flat arc and structure interact with each other. So if that sounds interesting, make sure to subscribe or stay tuned for that. If you want to help support the channel, I do have a Patreon. We have lots of fun things going on Patreon all the time, including a podcast that I do every other week for about half an hour. So if that's interesting to you, you can check out the Patreon, and I'll be back soon. And in the meantime, happy writing, guys.